Good morning, everyone. I'm Jeff Weigel from the Nature Conservancy and proud member of the Texas Land Trust Council Board. I'd like to welcome you to our session today, where we're going to hear from two really distinguished panelists that are going to talk about programs they run that cross boundaries, that work both in Texas, but also outside of Texas, internationally, and in other states. So I would urge you to keep a really open mind about how this might benefit you as a land trust. You're probably thinking, wow, is this going to help me? I'll tell you a quick story about myself. Years ago, I was fortunate enough to work with the TNC's Mexico program because we shared a lot of ecosystems and habitats with them. And I thought, well, that's going to be interesting. And I learned so much, figured out new ways to collaborate, develop partnerships, and so on. So keep that open mind and ask lots of questions. For housekeeping, we'll be doing the two presentations, one right after the other. So keep your questions in mind, and you can submit those through the chat. Once we get through both Amy and Liz, we'll do the Q&A, and Lori Olson is going to be fielding your questions and reading those out loud. So let's get underway. Our first speaker is Amy Robertson. Amy directs the Rio Grande Joint Venture, which is a public-private partnership conserving birds, their habitats, and the ecosystems that support wildlife and people across portions of Texas and northern Mexico. So it's binational. Amy provides leadership to conservation partnerships in the southwestern U.S. and northern Mexico, co-creating a vision integrating cultural values and ecological knowledge with science for meaningful decision-making and implementing shared strategies for conserving wildlife, water, and ecosystems. She currently works for the American Bird Conservancy and previously worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 15 years across the southwestern U.S. Amy has a master's in conservation biology from the University of Minnesota, go Gophers, and a BA from Macalester College. Amy, take it away.
All right, halito, good morning. I'm Amy Robertson, and first of all, I want to say thank you to the organizers. I know that these events take a lot of work to make happen, and especially to make them run smoothly. I've been very impressed with the people organizing this conference, and thanks to Jeff for inviting me to be on this panel, and to all of the participants for your interest in our work and our transboundary work we'll be discussing in this panel. I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm currently living and working from Alpine, Texas, which is the traditional homelands of the Humanos and the Mescalero Apache. I work for American Bird Conservancy as the coordinator for a public-private international partnership, the Rio Grande Joint Venture, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. It's telling you more about what we do and hopefully inspiring some ideas about how we can do more collaborative work with land trusts like y'all. All right. Whoops. Okay. So first, just an overview of the Migratory Bird Joint Ventures. So ours is just one of 24 joint ventures that span across the United States, into Canada, and into northern Mexico. The joint ventures have a landscape scale record of success established by the North American Waterfowl Management Plan in 1986. That was when the initial joint ventures were established, and the others have been rolled out since then. We focus on nonpartisan solutions. We work across political boundaries to find solutions for complex conservation issues. We are also, one of our strategies is to focus on the economic vitality for local communities. Our projects support jobs in tourism, construction, technology, restoration, forest products, and more. Of course, in addition to being focused on conserving ecosystems for birds and other wildlife and people in general. We also, another strategy is that most of us have a working lands conservation approach. So joint venture partnerships support collaborative conservation on private lands and active management of public lands. This leads to healthy habitat for wildlife and supports local livelihoods through improved forage production for ranching and sustainable agriculture practices. We make connections between people and nature. And certainly as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic that we've been experiencing globally for over a year now, people are turning to the natural world for solace and support now more than ever. And joint ventures create and protect spaces for everyone that provide recreation opportunities like bird watching, hiking, camping, hunting, fishing, and more. These activities support healthy lifestyles and connect people with nature. We are also looking to support the resiliency of communities. Our projects contribute to clean and sustainable municipal water supplies, flood and wildfire control, storm surge protection, pollution control, and carbon sequestration, among other things. Together, these provide resilience to the impacts of climate change. And over the course of our history, joint ventures have engaged with over 5,700 partners. We have helped to enhance, conserve, and restore over 28 million acres of essential habitat across North America for people and wildlife. We're also a good investment. Our base funding comes through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but we have leveraged 31 to 1 with non-federal partner dollars for every federally appropriated dollar. So that's just a little background on the joint ventures as a whole, and on the map you can see the different joint ventures. Ours is down here in far west Texas and South Texas and northern Mexico in that kind of lime green. So let's talk a little bit more about that. This is our geography. You can see we cover the Chihuahuan Desert, or at least a portion of the Chihuahuan Desert ecoregion that's in Texas and northern Mexico, the Tamaulipan brushland ecoregion, and a portion of the Gulf Coastal Plain ecoregion, the Laguna Madre in northern Mexico. And this is the logos of our management board. Again, we're a public-private partnership, so we've got federal and state agencies, as well as nonprofit conservation organizations, both in the US, in Texas, and in Mexico. And then we work with a whole bunch of other partners as well. A lot of universities, you see some of the ones we work most frequently with there at the bottom of the slide. But many more that would never fit on this slide. So our partnership, we have 3 staff. So myself as the coordinator, we have an assistant coordinator, Jesus Franco, who is in McAllen, Texas, and a conservation delivery specialist, Jeff Bennett, also here in Alpine, who works directly with environmental stewards, with land managers, both public and private, to improve habitats and ecosystems on their lands. And I'm going to be focusing on some of that work today in this presentation. We're really excited to be growing in the near future. We're going to be hiring a science coordinator for the partnership, and that should be announced in the next few weeks. So as you listen to what we do, if you might be interested or know someone who might be interested in the more technical side of things, helping us with the important science for conservation planning and evaluation, definitely get in contact with me. We'll be hiring a communications person soon as well, a part-time contractor. And then of course, across our partnership, we have many other people who add to the capacity of partnership through our bird science teams and local initiative teams. So the bird science teams are mostly focused on the plant conservation planning and evaluation side of things. And then the local initiative teams more on implementation, on how to actually get conservation on the ground. So here's a little bit more about the roles and responsibilities of our different folks working directly in the partnership. So the management board really focuses on developing a shared vision and mission for conservation, working together to identify and accomplish shared goals. seeking new partners to accomplish those goals, they help find resources to implement conservation actions, and then develop overall guidelines and policies for the partnership. And as I mentioned, the bird science teams are really focused on strategic habitat conservation, which is like a species-focused form of adaptive management. So that includes biological planning, conservation design, and planning the implementation of conservation actions, and making various recommendations to the board. Our local initiative teams, again, guide our conservation delivery programs. I'll be talking more about here in just a minute. So the vision of our partnership is the ecosystems across the binational Rio Grande Joint Venture landscapes support thriving and diverse communities of birds, other wildlife, and people into the future. The enabling conditions that we think are required to ultimately achieve this vision are that people recognize the value of nature and a network of connected habitats, that people proudly work together to sustainably manage lands and waters, minimizing ecosystem stressors, enhancing resiliency to climate change, and allowing for adaptation. And people coordinate and monitor conservation actions to allow for continuous learning and improvement. Under that, our mission really is to conserve birds and their habitats across our geography in the US and Mexico. And while we are bird focused, most of our board members work on a whole suite of wildlife species and other kinds of conservation projects. And we find that those really go hand in hand with bird conservation. And so we achieve this mission by bringing people together from both the US and Mexico, as I've mentioned, to increase our collective capacity for bird conservation planning, implementation, and evaluation. We share our resources to do these things and to address the most critical conservation issues related to declining bird populations, habitat loss and degradation, and climate change. And it's our goal to use the best available science and information to guide our decisions and actions, and then to connect with the broader conservation community to coordinate conservation of birds throughout their life cycles. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that, how we work with other joint ventures, particularly through the Central Flyway and the Central Grasslands of North America. So again, this is on the right, this is our strategic habitat conservation diagram. This is basically the foundational framework for how we work, which is like plan, act, learn, right? So adaptive management. And this is focused, we have operational goals that are really focused on conservation, and then supporting goals having to do with coordination and collaboration of the partnership, and also communication, education, and outreach. So within our partnership, we've identified priority habitats, and under each of these particular bird species that are declining or endemic or rare, that need special attention in terms of conservation actions. And so in the Chihuahuan Desert ecoregion, our priority habitats are grasslands, riparian corridors, and wetlands. In the Tamaulipan brushlands, it's pretty much the same. And then in the Gulf Coast Prairie, the Laguna Madre of Mexico, we are also focused on riparian corridors and coastal habitats. These are the habitats we've identified as where there's really the greatest need and opportunity for collaborative and collective conservation actions to help conserve birds. So I want to talk a little bit about these habitats and why we're concerned about them, and then I'll get into what we're doing about it and how where there might be opportunities to collaborate more with land trusts. So grasslands really is a concern across the board. We've seen that birds that breed in the Great Plains of Canada and the US and winter here in the Chihuahuan Desert grasslands are declining at an alarmingly steep rate, at a nearly 70% loss since 1970. World Wildlife Fund every year puts out the plow print report, and that's up until recently has been really focused on the breeding grounds of Canada and the northern Great Plains. And they've reported that we've lost more than 90% of the original prairie acreage to various forms of development, some of it to crop agriculture, but also other kinds of development, land conversion in general. We're particularly concerned about the native grasslands in central Chihuahua. They've been declining at an even more rapid rate. And we're also concerned about how some of the historic land uses and other factors have led to degradation of rangelands, including brush encroachment and soil erosion. And of course, there's many, many reasons to care about grasslands. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here on this one, but in addition to birds, there's many other wildlife species. You see some of them here. Of course, livestock. We work a lot with cattle producers, and people depend on grasslands for many different ecosystem benefits. And then the other priority habitat type I mentioned, riparian habitats and streams. So some of the reasons we're concerned about these, of course, in the more arid areas, we know how important these stream habitats are for all wildlife, and they've been shown to be particularly important for birds. And yet our historical accounts tell us that many of the riparian forests were logged to provide wood for mercury mines, fuel, and other needs in the past. And so there's a lot of work to be done here to improve our riparian habitats for birds and other species and for all of us. And of course, streams are often directly connected to aquifers. Many of them in our area are known to be incised and disconnected from the floodplain. And just due to their importance, we've been working with land managers, landowners, ecosystem stewards to really improve the function of these stream and riparian systems. And so when we think about what is a functional stream and riparian ecosystem, these are areas where there is adequate vegetation, landscape formations, and large woody debris to provide various functions for wildlife and people. So a healthy system will dissipate stream energy, protect banks, stabilize channel, reduce erosion, slow the velocity of floodwaters, drop sediment, trap sediment, build the floodplains, provide floodwater retention, enlarge the riparian sponge, thereby increasing how often the stream is actually flowing, and improve groundwater recharge. So we work together with many, again, across our partnership, and we have several programs that work directly with land managers. We have our South Texas Grassland Restoration Incentive Program. That's really focused on bobwhite and scaled quail and monarch butterflies and other pollinators, and working with landowners to improve the grass-dominated habitats that they manage. And the Chihuahuan Desert Conservation Partnership, we're focused there on grassland, riparian, and aquatic habitats. And so these programs provide assistance to landowners, both technical assistance and land managers, technical assistance as well as financial assistance. And they're really made to complement the state and federal partners and programs already existing. And then in Mexico, many of our partners are playing the same role, working with both private landowners and ejidos to improve rangeland management, as well as riparian and stream management. So basically, these are some of the practices that are most often needed when we are working with ecosystem stewards. On the technical assistance side, it's often controlling brush, either chemically or mechanically, sometimes seeding of native grasses and forbs, prescribed grazing that's done in a sustainable or regenerative way, as well as prescribed fire. And then the financial assistance, we are able to help the land managers out with is based on the NRCS practice rates. And so it's a cost share program where the land manager is often providing 25 to 50% of the cost. So they have a vested interest in the project, and they're often making a commitment to maybe defer grazing for a couple of growing seasons to provide optimal conditions for grass growth. On the riparian and stream side, our goal is really to reforest these areas where the trees have been cut down or overgrazed in some cases. That helps to rehydrate the stream itself and to really rebuild the physical template that the stream exists in. So we provide technical assistance like fencing and removing livestock or implementing rotational grazing, allowing young trees to establish. In wet reaches, we plant willow, cottonwoods, and other native riparian species to help create that riparian buffer and that good bird habitat. We work on control of invasive plant species. And then in wet or mostly wet reaches, we've been experimenting with building something that some people are calling beaver dam analogs, also known as brush weirs, where we're trying to imitate that good work of the beavers that helps to hold water back and really helps create that sponge in the riparian system. And then also using ancient techniques such as trincheras or one rock dams to really slow down overland flow of water and sediment and help the sediment and the topsoil stay where it is and build up and the water to percolate into the ground. And then, of course, we're also providing financial assistance for some of our partners as well. So one thing I really wanted to point out in thinking about grasslands, again, we're really in a crisis situation across this country in terms of losing our native prairie, native grassland, rangelands. We've seen, there's been a recent report that came out last year really focused on, the loss of 3 billion birds over the last several decades. We believe that about 720 million grassland birds overall have been lost since 1970. And this is just an example that 3 and 4 of eastern meadowlarks have been lost. We're in that area where you might see eastern meadowlarks or western meadowlarks, for those of you who might be birders out there. And then an overall decline of about 53% in the populations of grassland-dependent birds in that same time frame. But the good news is, and I think might be interesting to y'all, is that, as I mentioned, migratory bird joint ventures were initially created to address the loss of wetland birds, the decline of wetland birds and the loss of wetland habitats, and to bring state and federal and non-governmental partners together to really talk about how to do that. So several decades ago, and in working with Farm Bill programs and other programs, we've really seen this incredible recovery to a large degree in wetland birds, as you can see in the graph here. Grassland birds, unfortunately, have not been doing so well, and many of our joint ventures are turning to grasslands, really looking at what can be done, as our joint venture is. And generally, we have seen since 2003, when grassland easements were introduced through the Farm Bill, we have seen like an encouraging little increase. It's not much, but at least points to maybe these easements are helping to create the conservation of grasslands, opportunity for that might not have been there otherwise. So we're hopeful, and that certainly points to the important role of easements in bird conservation. So as I mentioned before, we really think about the full annual cycle of these birds. And so some of the grassland dependent bird species we're most concerned about winter here in Texas and spend part of their annual cycle in Canada or the Northern Great Plains. So we're actually working with joint ventures across the central grasslands of North America to try to increase awareness and actual implementation of various grassland conservation strategies. And so these are all those joint ventures depicted here on the map in that central grassland biome. So it's a very large area. Luckily, a lot of attention is coming to this issue now, and a lot of people are coming together and saying, what can we do to conserve grasslands? And there is definitely a big role for easements and land trusts in this work. I also want to remind you, I know this conference is focused on Texas as a whole, and there's several other joint ventures in Texas who are doing similar work to us. So even if your work is not necessarily in far West Texas or South Texas or the areas where the Rio Grande Joint Venture works, there are other joint ventures in your area doing similar work. Well, shoot, my slide's acting funny. So basically, let's talk a little bit about that. What does it mean to work together? What are the opportunities for land trusts in this work, and how might we collaborate? So of course, as I mentioned, our partnership is really inspired by a shared vision of a region where diverse populations of native fish and wildlife thrive. I think that's probably true for most of y'all in your organizations as well. We believe the well-being of our communities depends on the health of our landscape, waterways, and wildlife, and we believe we can accomplish more together than we can alone. And so in thinking, we work with several organizations already on our board or partners in general that are land trusts or act as in a similar role, like in Mexico. In the US, of course, we work with the Nature Conservancy quite a bit. We're working with NRCS and some of their easement programs. In Mexico, we have organizations like Por Natura Noreste, who put long-term and Ducks Unlimited de Mexico, who both work to put long-term agreements in place with landowners and land managers to help conserve the land. And so one of the things that I think our partnership can do that might be helpful to land trusts is this kind of active management role where we can help bring in technical assistance either directly from our staff or one of our many partners, sometimes that financial assistance to help get that good work done that's, again, benefiting birds, but almost always benefiting other wildlife, often benefiting livestock production and other benefiting people in other ways as well. So I think there's just really a ton of opportunities there. So when we get to the questions and answers here in a moment, I definitely want to hear from y'all if you think there are other ways you see that we could work together. I definitely want to hear about that. I also want to mention this really encouraging trend we're seeing both in Mexico and the US of conservation partners as well as land trusts starting to really look specifically at how they can work with indigenous communities and tribes to be better allies and partners in conservation. So it's an area where land trusts in other parts of the country, especially, I think, are really starting to look at that. And there's just really a lot of opportunity there for conserving land and conserving cultures. So if that's something you're interested in, and I hope you are, I do want to put a brief plug in for this really great book. It's called As Long as Grass Grows by Dina Gilio-Whitaker. Looks like this. And it's really fascinating in looking at the history of Indigenous environmental justice, but also talks a lot about the conservation community, talks about land trusts and ways that we can all work together in ways that are probably innovative compared to how many of us have been working. So just want to put that out there. And yeah, that's all I have to present for now, but I'd be happy to hear any questions or comments.
Thank you, Amy. That was terrific. And we really appreciate you coming on today to give your presentation. We'll hold the Q&A until after Liz is done. So we're now going to switch over to my good friend and colleague, Liz Smith. Liz is a native Texan. She received her bachelor's and master's from, I guess, what they used to call Corpus Christi State University before the Aggies took it over, right? And she got her PhD at the main campus at Texas A&M. Dr. Smith served as a research scientist at the Center for Coastal Studies at A&M Corpus for 17 years. I got to know you there when we did some work together on the Laguna Madre. That was fun. Prior to joining the International Crane Foundation in 2011, my goodness, it's been 10 years, she developed the Texas Whooping Crane Program and now serves as North America Program Director, as well as a Texas Program Leader. The Texas coast, of course, plays a really important role in the recovery of whooping cranes because they need large expanses of quality coastal habitat each winter within and around places like the Aransas Wildlife Refuge. As this population increases, we're expanding, meaning the Crane Foundation, are expanding their geographic scope up the Texas coast to ensure more high quality habitat is available for recovery. Of course, their main goal is to achieve recovery of the whooping crane by working with landowners and agencies and so on to get that work done. They often serve as a liaison between landowners and conservation programs that their partners can provide that's beneficial to conserving habitat and maintaining economic sustainability so those lands continue to be available for conservation. So Liz, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. Yes, looking through the geography that we just went through, it just brings back a lot of memories of all of the different work that we've done along the coast and the overlaps for the whooping cranes. So I am a Texas native and actually was born in El Paso. My mother's family came from Mexico and my father's paternal family came from Canada. So this is really kind of cool, connecting my geography to what I work with. Let me go back one. Okay, so the Crane Foundation actually does work worldwide and works with partners and takes lead on the 15 species around the world, and 11 of which are actually threatened or endangered with extinction. Of those 15 species, only 2 species occur in the Western Hemisphere. So these species are the sandhill crane, which is the most numerous, abundant crane in the world, and the whooping crane, which is the rarest crane in the world. Very interesting dichotomy. Looking at, why is that is very key to our conservation work with both species. The sandhill crane actually encompasses a very, very broad area in their breeding range, shown here in green, and even goes across into, another international border into Russia for breeding. And then as they migrate down particular flyways, they have specific wintering areas. Now, there's 3 different subspecies of sandhill cranes. However, there's a certain proportion of them in each one of these wintering ranges. So very, very complex and interesting species. Actually more of a grassland species, but still requiring wetlands for roosting and for breeding. But they have been able to make a transition from the conversion of native prairie to grain farming. The whooping crane actually had a much more restricted range throughout the lower boreal forest in Canada into the prairie pothole region over into the Great Lakes region. And actually the last pair that nested in the United States was in Iowa. And so this restricted range also encompassed along the Gulf Coast of Texas, northern Mexico, and Louisiana, and a small portion of the Atlantic coast, but also in the Intermountain Plateaus in Mexico. And as we just discussed, that area has been largely converted. Groundwater has changed from agricultural practices, etc. And so now the species actually has one natural wild population that is self-sustaining, and that is that they migrate up from here in coastal Texas to the Wood Buffalo National Park, where they breed and then return down to the wintering grounds along the coast, a 2,500-mile flyway. Very narrow corridor, about 150 to 200 miles wide. The unusual aspect of these species is that they do not fly at night, so they must roost every night in a wetland. And this creates a very big challenge in the flyway for conservation and protection of those areas that are so critical to it. And certainly a lot of partners that are coming together to make that work happen. So I wanted to go through just an annual cycle of whooping cranes in the Aransas wood buffalo population. They've left this area now and are up in Wood Buffalo National Park and in the Northwest Territory First Nations. And they quickly build a nest. They lay 2 eggs, usually one survives. That small chick grows an inch a day, learns to fly by August, and makes that first 2,500-mile trip with its parents down to the wintering grounds in and around the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. There they continue to learn how to feed on very, very different prey items, including blue crab, of which is their mainstay, which should be the most abundant species for them in a healthy coastal ecosystem. And that little crane, when it first gets down here, its beak isn't even strong enough to break the crab open, so their parents teach it that throughout the winter. When they return north, somewhere along the way, the parents leave it. It just wakes up one morning on the Platte River and his parents are gone, and it joins other subadults for 2 to 5 years before it pairs up and begins this cycle with its mate. So the different goals for this species recovery is to support 250 breeding pairs in the breeding habitat in the Northwest Territories. And this is something that does not seem to be too much of an overwhelming scenario, since Wood Buffalo National Park is over 1 million acres. While some of that is not prime breeding habitat, there is plenty for this species to recover. And then as we look at the migration corridor habitats, the top picture is in southwestern Saskatchewan. And very interestingly, in that area of which most of the prairie has been lost and converted to farmlands, but here they stage on the way down to Texas and actually just feast on waste grain and gain that young juvenile strength for the trip. In this picture, this is 151 whooping cranes, families, subadults, pairs that were captured in one fall migration a couple of years ago. Really unprecedented and very exciting to know that the species is recovering in this way. And then as they move down the Great Plains corridor, they use those braided flat prairie rivers for roosting and for resting. And so it's like a ladder, a conservation ladder all the way down into Texas, which they generally stop at the border of Texas and then make one big push down to the coast. So the goal for the wintering habitat is, of course, providing this sufficient habitat for 1,000 individuals and 250 breeding pairs. This is from our international recovery plan. And then also we've had a wintering working group, a consortium of agencies and NGOs and universities that meets and actually developed a specific metric to conserve 125,000 acres of coastal marsh and 300 1,000 acres of coastal prairies and fresh marsh adjacent to that coastal marsh. So we do have goals for the wintering habitat. So how are we doing in terms of that 1,000 individuals to downlist the species from endangered to threatened? There is a survey that's been conducted since the early 40s and continues throughout this time period. There was a low of 16 birds at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in 1941. And there were many that felt that the species was doomed. This was a genetic bottleneck. How could they recover from that? But in fact, they have. And so as they've slowly increased over time, they've needed more habitat, of course. And so we're the estimates by the Fish and Wildlife Service with their annual surveys in 2019 estimated about 505 individuals. And this is about halfway to the 1,000 bird goal. So when we look at the survey that was conducted by the Canadian Wildlife Service in May of 2019, we had about 97 nests. So we're not up to that 125 nest, halfway mark, but mainly that's because it's been expanding so quickly. We have a very young population. And so we have high hopes that as they mature that this number will continue to increase. No survey in 2020 in the breeding grounds won't happen again this year. No annual survey for the population estimate in the wintering grounds by Fish and Wildlife Service, all because of COVID. But regardless of that, the cranes are still doing what the cranes have always done. And so we look forward to finding out how much they've increased next year. So as we look at this wintering ground area, this is where the concern was that with a variety of land use changes, that this could be the limiting factor in the recovery of the species, which is why we established a program here in Texas. And as we look at this elevation map, we see that there's just this really low coastal gradient of elevation. And along with that, then, a lot of coastal marsh habitat. And also along the Texas coast, we range from 50 inches of rain annually per year in the southeast Texas at the upper right, down to 19 inches or less in the lower Rio Grande area. And so along with that, then we have a diversity of wetlands along the coast. And in historic times when the Rio Grande Delta was in its prime, there were many, many cranes wintering in that area. So as we go further northeast along the coast, with this increasing rainfall, we actually have much more estuarine and fresh marsh habitat. And so this is very heartening as the cranes move into this area. So this is from a report by Jim Blackburn and his students. Very good plan for the Texas coast, excellent resource, synthesizing a lot of really great information. And so this shows that here that there's a smaller amount of industry by aerial extent, and then developed lands, and there's about 7% protected lands, and the remainder is private lands. And so working with private landowners is really key to our conservation initiatives. And it's not that we feel like that should change. Actually, these birds are utilizing these ranches and farms because of the conservation actions that these landowners employ. So we are really, really excited as we move northeastward to increase that connection. So the question about these protected lands, we actually have many different land partners. This is grouped just to get on this slide. Certainly we see the Park Service for the National Seashore there, spanning the lower extent, wildlife refuges, state wildlife management areas all along the coast, and also the non-governmental organizations, in which would include, of course, land trusts that have protected these lands. So the Whooping Crane program in Texas is really focused on this extent of land where we work. The orange shows the where we started in 2011 and where the birds were currently concentrated. And then as the cranes have increased and started exploring, the light orange shows where we're working now. And this is for the Aransas wood buffalo population. The other is the green is actually a Louisiana non-migratory population that was reintroduced. There were cranes in Louisiana that did not migrate historically. And so they've been reintroduced in southwestern Louisiana, but they are coming over. They do not recognize geopolitical boundaries, and they are in some of the counties in East Texas. And so the people that we work with are the people on working lands, and also with our partners from the agencies, and all of us working together. So when I say we, I mean the conservation community. So our work here in the first 10 years, several really great partners. We collaborated with the San Antonio Bay Partnership, which was getting funding from the Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries Program, which was getting that funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to actually establish more freshwater resources on the landscape for whooping cranes. During droughts, they need to leave the coastal marshes and find dietary drinking water. And so the Waters for Wildlife program, of which the San Antonio Bay Partnership is a major contributor to, as well as other organizations. We've worked with them to identify where these resources are needed for the whooping crane, as well as providing the monitoring showing their, how the cranes use them. So it's been a really great program to open those ranch gates and to gain the trust of those landowners, as well as to identify how important these resources are to cranes and continue to do this work. This year, we are not putting in another well. We're actually developing a management document, guidance document, that isn't what we're writing. It's asking the landowners what they're doing so we can share that with other landowners and increase the diversity of wildlife that use them. So the question becomes, again, whenever I give a presentation or a report, it's like, how far have we come? How many acres are conserved? It seems like a pretty simple question. However, it isn't a simple question, because a lot of the work that we do with private landowners, it remains private and confidential. And so we do feel that there's a way for us, path forward for us as a non-governmental organization to help collate this information without having any confidentiality issues. So we've developed this habitat conservation GIS database and to help us with this work. And so the base layer is, of course, an imagery layer. And then we use this land use land cover map product from Texas Parks and Wildlife for habitat. We additionally use the National Wetland Inventory maps to identify those particular wetlands. Using location data to identify where whooping cranes are and what kind of habitat they're using. The result of that being several iterations of whooping crane habitat suitability models that can guide our work. And we are currently using the Fish and Wildlife Service product that just came out last year. To maintain those summaries of the amount of lands that are conserved, we do that by county in order to keep that confidentiality clear. And then we also additionally use parcel data to identify tracts of land of interest, identify landowners, talk to our partners to see who's working with them and see if we can be introduced. And then also being able to have this protected database layer. The US layer by USGS, the Protected Area Database, you hear people call it PADIS, is an amazing product, but it's dependent on people and entities turning in their tracts of land to be in that database. So it isn't comprehensive because of this lack of information input. And so it's fairly easy to update federal and state lands just by requesting their GIS data. But what we really are lacking in there is the non-governmental lands. And so one of the things we'd like to offer to the Land Trust, Texas Land Trust Alliance and Council is, helping get these tracks and these numbers into this database so we know how we're doing. And from that, then our metrics for calculating areas with suitable habitat for whooping cranes is achieved, and we can also track projects over time. So this is our map database, and it incorporates many different things here. What of particular interest, the color ramp is actually the suitability index for whooping cranes by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that bright red shows that habitat. And as you can see, it's not very obvious along the coast in the lower area as it is in the central Texas area, in which we begin to have a lot more freshwater and intermediate marshes that they can utilize. So this has been, a valuable resource, and certainly is a great model to work from. But you can't just go to a desktop and answer questions. You need to be out on the ground and field truthing this data, and also working with landowners and understanding it better. So as we use our parcel data, we're able to go in and actually update that conservation database to where we can say, yes, this is in the database. This is Port O'Connor Cedar Ridge, and the lower left shows that there are many easements covering this very important area for whooping cranes. And then the fact that there's some new additions to our conservation portfolio that we can include as well. So the really exciting aspect of this is, working with land trusts along the coastal region. The ones that are shown here in the gray area, the Gulf of Mexico, are listed in the website as being working across the region, working statewide. And so conceptually, they could be a conservation partner for a private landowner anywhere along the coast. And so what we did was we went in and we said, well, what are we going to say to a landowner if he or she says, I'm thinking about maybe a conservation easement and maybe a non-governmental organization. What land trust would we talk to? So we came in and we actually created the data from the website about these different land trusts in these different counties and the amount of habitat that is shown as being conserved. And as you notice, as we go through this, you'll see that there are, regional interests by these land trusts by and large, such as the Coastal Bend Basin Estuaries Program working in our lower extent area. And then as we move northward, there's a real interest by the Guadalupe Blanco River Trust in that basin. So as we built this, we were very, very impressed with how much opportunity there is for us to work with y'all in these important areas for whooping cranes, and also to identify if these numbers are accurate or if they've increased. So this is something that we'd like to get started on right away with interested land trusts. And as these birds move northward, I can tell you that they are moving northward. There's a lot of confidentiality in whooping crane data as well. And so we suffice it to say that in all these counties that we've touched on thus far, there are whooping cranes exploring it as they expand their range. The other aspect of this too is that these East Texas cranes from Louisiana are of interest to us as well. We're elated to work with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries in this area and working with rice farmers and crawfish farmers as we're doing right now. So this totals up to about 336,000 acres. Well, if we needed 325,000 acres for whooping cranes or 350, we've achieved that goal. However, we need to see if that land, all of those parcels are habitat that's open for whooping cranes. They do not, they don't occur in wooded areas, dense brush, etc. So I think that it would be a real benefit for us to know how many land trusts actually can support cranes. So there's another aspect to this, and that is that that we also need to think about what's happening in the future. Climate change are one of our main impacts from that we need to deal with is sea level rise, and not just global sea level rise. We also have a lot of land subsidence that occurs along the coast, and in some areas higher than others. And so these areas will flood more quickly than others. And so the adjacent coastal prairie and working lands along that coastline, if it is undeveloped, that marsh and coastal prairie can migrate inland and upland as sea levels rise. And so it's very important for us to be working on that now, even though that sea level rise scenario may not occur for decades. So I'm just using Seadrift Potter Ridge again as an example. And as you'll see here, that currently, this is at the current sea level. And then as we increase it by 1 foot, you'll see that the blue areas are those that are getting inundated, and that marsh is increasing upland as well as coastal prairies. And as these birds continue to increase in numbers, we're going to need more marsh, and certainly the areas that have been conserved along here are key. So I wanted to mention that it isn't the cranes that we need to help. They're doing just fine. There is an amazing, has a fierce eye, is very aggressive. It rules the habitat that it's in, but it's more about what we do to ensure that it has enough habitat to recover that's important. So as we look at this, opportunity to know that cranes are coming up the coast and that they are seeking out habitat, that we keep up with that and ensure that in these working lands that it's available for them. So I end with an Aldo Leopold quote, "There are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot." I believe that I'm speaking with people who cannot, and I look forward to working with you. And thank you.
Thank you, Liz. That was terrific. And thank you, Amy. You guys both did a great job. And you both did exactly what I asked of you, as you recall, which is that I said, how are you working with land trusts and how can land trusts work with you? So that was really important to cover, and I appreciate that. Lori, do we have any time for questions?
Yeah, we have a little bit of time for questions, and I just want to echo those comments from Jeff. I think it's very exciting to see. I loved your map with all the different groups working in those different areas, and to see the the roles that all of us as conservation entities can play in uniting along these conservation goals is exciting, and so I hope that more collaborations will occur as a result of this, and we're happy to facilitate some of those if that's of interest to folks. So someone was asking about the role of chemical fertilizers like pesticides and or herbicides, and what role that plays on sort of the native grassland issue with the wild bird population's recovery, or is it more just a strict habitat degradation issue?
That's really a great question. I assume that one's for me.
Yeah.
That's a great question and something we really don't fully understand yet. I suspect it's playing a larger role than we understand, but there are some studies and investigations underway, and frankly, probably need more to really understand what's happening there, particularly for the birds that are insectivores, but also just because of the role that insects generally play in the ecosystem. They have many important roles, and I do suspect there's some issues there.
Great. And one more just quick question that we have was about that someone had heard that recently hunting is now allowed of sandhill cranes in Texas. Can you comment on that? And are there any limits or issues during migration season or otherwise, or any comments on that issue?
Sure. Yes, sandhill cranes are hunted in many states in the United States, and they are hunted in Canada. They number in between 900,000 and 1.1 million continental wide. The questions that we come up with is when that overlaps with these recovering whooping crane populations. And so we do a lot of work along the Texas coast of getting information out and hunter knowledge packets out to area hunter guides and also the lodges. And so we feel that anything that happens that is accidental, we can cover with just knowing the difference. Anything that is done by a vandal is not a hunting thing, it's a vandal shooting, and we deal with those and support that in court. In the flyway, the wildlife refuge along the flyway, they do close the refuges to hunting if they're in an open season while the cranes are in the area. So that's a good
practice. You mean the whooping cranes, crane.
Yeah, when whooping cranes are there. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we're out of time.
We're going to call it a wrap. So thank you, Liz and Amy. You guys both did a fabulous job. I really appreciate you taking the time to come out. And Lori, we might, if we can, share their contact info with folks to see if anybody wants to forward a question to them directly.
Absolutely. And these presentations will be on the website too, so y'all can go back and check those out there.